Tonight, we are drifting slowly into the complete history of the Horus Heresy, the civil war that tore the Imperium of Man apart at the moment of its greatest triumph, that turned brother against brother, that brought the most beloved son of the Emperor to the gates of Terra with fire and ruin in his wake, and that left a wound in the soul of humanity so deep it has never fully healed, 10,000 years hence. This is the story of a golden age undone by whisper and shadow, of a son who was everything his father made him to be, and precisely because of that, the perfect instrument of his father's enemies, of 18 legions that marched as one and shattered into fragments, of a siege that lasted 200 days and ended with the emperor broken upon the golden throne he never wished to occupy. This is how the Age of Hope became the Age of Fire. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling. If you leave before the end, you will miss the moment the Emperor looks into the eyes of his fallen son aboard the Vengeful Spirit and what passes between them in those final seconds. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Let's begin. To understand how everything broke, you must first understand how everything was built. The age of strife had lasted for thousands of years. It was an epoch of silence and suffering, warp storms blinding star from star, human worlds left isolated in the dark, prey to alien raiders, demonic incursions, and the slow erosion of everything that civilization had once meant. On countless worlds, humanity had forgotten it had ever been anything other than hunted. The stars themselves seemed indifferent, and in that long dark somewhere in the deserts of Terra, a being of immeasurable psychic power waited and planned and endured. The Emperor of Mankind, that ageless, nameless figure who had walked among human history for longer than most civilizations had existed, finally revealed himself in the 30th millennium. He had spent millennia quietly guiding humanity from the shadows, but the time for shadow had passed. The warp storms were receding. A window had opened, and the Emperor, with the single-minded clarity of a man who has waited longer than any other being alive, moved. He unified Terra through will, through war, through a combination of political genius and sheer overwhelming force that left no ambiguity about who would govern the birth world of humanity. Then he built what no man before him had possessed the vision to construct: the Space Marine Legions. Transhuman warriors, genetically elevated far beyond the limits of ordinary men, bound together by the implanted gene seed that transformed recruits into something that had barely existed in the natural world before. Soldiers who could survive vacuum, who healed from wounds that would kill 3 men, who processed information at speeds that made them ghosts to unaugmented eyes. 20 legions, hundreds of thousands of warriors apiece, at their height, the finest killing force humanity had ever assembled. At their head, the Primarchs, 20 demigods, each one crafted by the Emperor himself from his own genetic material, each one a psychic and physical paragon designed to lead a legion and inspire a species. The project that created them was the most ambitious act of genetic engineering in human history. And then the warp took them. Before the Primarchs could be united with their legions, something reached into the Emperor's laboratory on Terra and scattered the 20 infant demigods across the galaxy like seeds thrown into a storm. Each one fell upon a different world. Each one grew up in isolation, shaped by circumstances that the Emperor had not planned and could not have predicted. Some fell upon worlds of savage beauty, some upon worlds of grinding poverty and oppression, some upon worlds of rigid military hierarchy, some upon worlds where the only law was survival. One of them fell upon a world called Chthoniya, a hollow, mined-out planet of hive gangs and territorial violence, where authority meant nothing and strength meant everything. His name, in time, would be Horus. The Great Crusade was the campaign to reunite humanity's scattered worlds beneath the banner of the Imperium. World by world, system by system, the legions swept outward from Terra, making compliance, peaceful if possible, by force if necessary. Alien empires that had preyed upon isolated human worlds for centuries were broken and scattered. Human civilizations that had survived the Long Dark were absorbed, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. The Emperor walked beside his sons. The Primarchs were found, one by one, and returned to their legions. A galaxy that had been dark for thousands of years began, slowly, impossibly, to glow again. At the height of the Crusade, it seemed that the Emperor's vision was not merely ambitious, but achievable. A unified humanity, a rational civilization free of superstition and warp worship, guided by science and secular reason. The imperial truth, no gods, no demons, only humanity, ascending by its own effort. It was, in its way, a beautiful dream. And it was precisely that beauty that made the betrayal, when it came, so catastrophic. Among all 20 Primarchs, Horus Lupercal was the first found, the first beloved, and by every measure available, the greatest. He was the War Master. The title itself was the Emperor's own creation, bestowed upon Horus alone when the Emperor withdrew from the front lines of the Crusade to return to Terra and begin a secret project beneath the Imperial Palace. The Primarchs needed a leader in the Emperor's absence. The legions needed a supreme commander, and the Emperor chose Horus without hesitation, over the protests of none and the agreement of all. Even the proudest of the other Primarchs, and pride ran deep in all of them, could not dispute the choice. Horus was everything the word Primarch implied. In battle, he was a force of nature, his armor the color of the void, his eyes carrying a warmth that seemed impossible in a being of such physical power. He could read a battlefield the way others read a room, understanding pressure points and vulnerabilities and opportunities that no ordinary mind would perceive. He was generous with praise and precise with criticism. He remembered names. He understood that the greatest weapon a commander possesses is not the loyalty of soldiers who fear him, but the loyalty of soldiers who believe in him. His brothers adored him. Some of them, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, Magnus of the Thousand Suns, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, loved him in the way that beings of great power rarely permit themselves to love, completely, without reservation, with the vulnerability that love always requires. The Lunar Wolves, the legion he had led before they became the Sons of Horus in his honor, would have walked into the sun at his command, not because they feared what would happen if they refused, because they genuinely believed there was nowhere worth going that he would not lead them. The Emperor, watching from Terra, saw all of this, and the warp, which had watched the Emperor far longer than the Emperor had watched the warp, saw an opportunity. The Chaos Gods are not beings of simple malice. They are vast, ancient intelligences crystallized from the sum of mortal emotion across millennia. Khorne from rage and slaughter, Tzeentch from ambition and change, Nurgle from despair and decay, Slaanesh from excess and sensation. They exist in the warp as titanic pressures of feeling and intent, and they are patient in ways that mortal minds cannot compass. They had watched the Emperor's crusade with something that might, in human terms, be called alarm. An imperium of secular reason spread across the galaxy, its billions of souls no longer feeding the warp with prayer and fear and worship. This was not merely a political threat to the Chaos Gods. It was an existential one. If humanity ceased to believe in gods, the gods that fed on humanity's belief would diminish. And so the powers of the warp moved, not with armies, not with direct assault, with a word, placed at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right ear. The instrument they found was not a weak man. It never is. The instrument they found was Erebus, first chaplain of the Word Bearers Legion, a scholar of forbidden texts, a collector of secrets the Emperor had expressly prohibited, a man who had already chosen the path of devotion to powers the Imperial truth declared did not exist. Erebus was brilliant, patient, and utterly convinced that what he served was not chaos but truth. He was, in his way, a true believer, which made him far more dangerous than any ordinary traitor. The campaign that would bring Horus within reach of corruption was called the Ullanor Crusade, the largest military operation in the Great Crusade's history, a campaign against an immense Orc empire whose war boss, Urlak Uruk, commanded a force the size of which had not been seen since the darkest years of human history. The crusade succeeded. Horus broke the Orc Empire at its peak, shattered its armies, killed its war boss, and stood upon the ruins of Ullanor as the undisputed military genius of his age. It was the triumph at Ullanor that prompted the Emperor to name Horus Warmaster, the highest point of the Great Crusade, the moment everything crested. Erebus had been watching, and he had been patient. The world of Davin was a backwater, a feudal planet that had been brought into compliance years before, now governed by a garrison and a handful of imperial officers who had gone native in ways that would not have pleased their superiors. The atmosphere was thick and warm, its jungles breathing with a particular humidity that settled on the skin like a second garment. Strange things were said to happen in the deeper jungles of Davin. Old priests spoke of powers that did not answer to the Emperor. Horus was brought to Davin following a campaign on his moon, a campaign that had not gone as expected, in which the garrison commander had fallen to something that might charitably be called heresy and more accurately be called damnation. In the course of that campaign, Horus was wounded by a weapon called the Kinnebrach Anathime, a blade that had been placed in exactly the right position by Erebus, who had arranged everything. The campaign, the weapon, the wound, the whisper that followed. The wound would not heal. Primarchs did not sicken. Their bodies were miracle engines of regeneration. And yet, Horus lay aboard the Vengeful Spirit, burning with fever, growing pale by degrees, his inner circle watching with a dread they could not name. Erebus, presenting himself as a man of concern, offered a solution. There were healers on Davin, ancient healers, the shamans of the Serpent Lodges, who knew remedies that imperial medicine did not. All they required was access to the Warmaster. What happened in those lodges? What Horus experienced in the warp vision that the shamans placed him within was not a healing. It was a revelation. He was shown a future. A future the warp constructed with exquisite care. The Emperor enthroned as a god, humanity enslaved in worship to him, the Primarchs forgotten, their legacies erased, their sacrifices unrewarded. He was shown the Lectitio Divinitatus, the growing movement that declared the Emperor a god, and told that this was what the Emperor always intended, that the secular crusade was a lie, that the imperial truth was the most elegant deception ever constructed. None of it was real. All of it was persuasive. And when Horus woke from the vision, something had changed in him that no one immediately noticed, not because the change was subtle, but because they were not looking for it. He was warm and generous and present, exactly as he had always been. Only now, somewhere behind those familiar eyes, a calculation had begun that would consume everything. A fire does not announce itself. It begins with heat, then with a single point of ignition, then with a spread that seems sudden only to those who are not watching the conditions build. In the months following Davin, Horus moved carefully. He was the War Master. He had the authority to convene meetings, to redirect legions, to make decisions that did not require the Emperor's direct approval. He used that authority with the same precision he had always applied to military planning. Only now the campaign he was planning was not against an alien empire, but against everything he had helped build. He reached out to his brothers, not all of them. He knew which ones could be turned and which ones could not, and he did not waste time on Rogel Dawn or Sanguinius or Guilliman. He went to those who had grievances, real grievances, the kind that the Warp's whispers had not needed to manufacture, but only to illuminate. Ungron of the World Eaters had never forgiven the Emperor for the butcher's nails, the cranial implants that kept him in a state of permanent rage, that had been installed by slave masters on the world where he had been enslaved, that the Emperor had chosen not to remove when he claimed Angron for the Crusade. Angron's rage was real. The Warp simply pointed it in a new direction. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, whose pursuit of perfection had led him into the arms of Slaanesh, even before the heresy formally began. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, who had spent the crusade assigned to the most thankless sieges and the most brutal garrison duties, while his brothers won glory. Mortarion of the Death Guard, who had grown up hating the psychers his father collected and trusted. Lorga of the Word Bearers, who had been publicly humiliated by the Emperor for his religious devotion and had never recovered from the wound of that censure. One by one, through argument, through manipulation, through the simple acknowledgement of pain that had been ignored for too long, Horus gathered his coalition. Not all who joined him were already damned. Some believed his version of events. Some believed they were preventing a tyranny. Some had been so thoroughly exposed to the Warp's corruption that their capacity for unmanipulated thought had already been compromised. And some, perhaps, simply loved Horus too much to refuse him, and did not look closely enough at what he was asking. Half of the 20 legions would eventually stand with the War Master. The other half would stand against him. And in the moment of division, the greatest military force humanity had ever constructed became the engine of humanity's near destruction. The Isstvan system sits at a strategic crossroads of warp routes, a cluster of worlds that, in the 30th millennium, hummed with the low vibration of industrial output and military movement. Isstvan III itself was a civilized world, its spires rising in the amber light of its star, its streets largely unaware of what was being decided about them by men who held the power of gods. Before Horus could openly declare his rebellion, he needed to secure his own legions. Specifically, he needed to remove from his legions every warrior who had not yet been brought into the conspiracy, every loyal soldier, every man who might resist, every voice that might warn terror. His solution was monstrous in its efficiency. The loyal elements of the traitorous legions, the sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's children, were sent to the surface of Isstvan III under the pretense of suppressing a rebellion. They fought, they bled, they secured ground. And then, once they were in the field, spread out across the landscape of a world they were supposed to be pacifying, Horus ordered his fleet to deploy a weapon called the Life-Eater virus. The virus bombed Isstvan III. Billions of civilians died in the first moments. The atmosphere itself caught fire as the virus consumed organic material at a rate that defied comprehension. A phenomenon called the firestorm that turned the sky into a furnace and the ground into ash. Every living thing on Isstvan III that had not been sealed in void-shielded armor perished. The loyal Marines on the surface, betrayed by their own commanders, by their own primarchs, by the war master they had served without question, fought on. They had nowhere to retreat to. Horus had made certain of that. Some of them survived for weeks. Saul Tarvids of the Emperor's Children, a captain who had learned of the betrayal barely in time and chosen his brothers over his orders, led the loyalists with a quiet ferocity that the planet's ruins could not extinguish. They fortified rubble. They rationed ammunition. They fought knowing the war was already lost, because some things are worth fighting for even when the outcome is not in question. In the end, Horus sent his finest warriors to finish what the virus had not. The survivors of Isstvan III were destroyed. Their names were not recorded. The first atrocity of the Horus Heresy was not committed against a rival empire. It was committed against the Emperor's own Marines by the Emperor's own sons. That was its particular quality of horror. Word reached Terra. It moved through the warp slowly, unreliably, the way all information moved through those lanes of folded space. But it reached Terra, and the Emperor's response was swift. 7 legions were dispatched to the Isstvan system. 7 legions to bring the War Master to heel, to end the rebellion before it could spread, to demonstrate that the Imperium's response to treason was overwhelming and immediate. The world chosen for the confrontation was Isstvan V, a desolate place of black sand and volcanic rock, its horizon broken by mountain ranges that seemed to have been placed there specifically for the staging of slaughter. The Loyalist legions came in 2 waves. The first wave, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, would deploy first, pin the traitor forces on the surface, and hold the landing zones, while the second wave arrived to complete the encirclement. The first wave fought. The black sand of Isstvan V was soaked before the engagement had lasted an hour. The Iron Hands, under their Primarch Ferrus Manus, a man of iron literally and temperamentally, whose hands had been replaced with living metal, pressed the attack with characteristic relentlessness. The Salamanders under Vulcan, patient and tenacious. The Raven Guard under Corvus Corax, fighting with the kind of controlled fury that comes from clarity of purpose. Then the second wave landed. The Word Bearers, the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, the Iron Warriors. Legions that were supposed to be loyalist reinforcements. Legions that opened fire on the first wave's rear. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter contained within a trap. The first wave had no retreat and no reinforcement. The black sand offered no shelter that could withstand the fire of 2 full armies. The Salamanders were broken, their Primarch lost. The Raven Guard was shattered into fragments that would spend years rebuilding from near extinction. And Ferrus Manus, who had charged personally toward the battlefield in the desperate fury that had always been his defining quality, encountered Fulgrim, his brother, his closest friend, a being he had loved with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who expects that love to be permanent. Fulgrim, now fully given to the service of Slanesh, whose blade carried the blessing of his patron god. Ferrus Manus died on Isstvan V, the first Primarch to fall in the heresy, killed by his dearest brother, his head taken as a trophy. His iron hands would carry the grief of that day for 10,000 years, encoding it into their culture as a wound that never fully closes. The day of revelation, the moment when the Primarch's human heart was finally understood to be a liability and purged. The Drop Site Massacre was the moment the Horus Heresy became undeniable. Before Isstvan IV, it might have been possible to imagine the situation as a crisis that diplomacy could resolve. A misunderstanding scaled up to catastrophic proportions. After Isstvan V, there was no ambiguity. The galaxy was at war. In the years that followed Isstvan V, the Horus Heresy ceased to be a rebellion and became a civilization-ending catastrophe spread across 10,000 light-years. Every front produced its own particular horror. The Word-bearers, under their embittered Primarch Lorgar, attacked the realm of Ultramar. The 500 worlds governed by Robout Guilliman and his Ultramarines with a precision and competence that had always quietly irritated the other legions. The Word-bearers came not merely to conquer, but to corrupt. Their chaplains moved behind the front lines, establishing cults, opening warp rifts, attempting to transform stable imperial worlds into festering nodes of chaos influence. The Ultramarines held, but the cost of holding was measured in worlds and decades. The Night Lords spread through the outlying systems like a slow poison, their methods designed not to defeat defenders, but to break them. Broadcasts of atrocity, orchestrated terror, the calculated destruction of everything that made ordinary people willing to resist. Night Lord Voidcraft moved without running lights, arriving in the dark of systems where the population had heard only rumor, and what they did upon arrival was recorded and transmitted to the next target. Magnus the Red and his 1,000 Sons present a particular tragedy that sits apart from the broader conflict. Magnus had attempted, before the heresy formally began, to warn the Emperor of Horus's corruption through a direct psychic message. A message so powerful it shattered the psychic wards protecting the Emperor's secret project beneath Terra. The Emperor's response was to order the Space Wolves to bring Magnus to Terra for judgment. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, and never a man given to the subtleties of political interpretation, arrived at Prospero, the 1,000 Sons' homeworld, with his legion and a mandate that he interpreted as permission for destruction. The burning of Prospero was among the most devastating acts of the early heresy. The 1,000 Sons' homeworld, a planet of libraries and academies and the accumulated psychic knowledge of a legion, was reduced to ash. Magnus escaped into the warp, but the experience of watching his world destroyed for the act of trying to prevent the catastrophe broke something in him that would not be repaired. He fell to Tzeentch, in whose labyrinthine schemes the Crimson King became simply another piece on a board too vast to fully see. And on a moon called Calth, the Word-bearers launched a surprise assault against the Ultramarines that was so sudden, so thoroughly planned, that the initial engagement happened while the two legions were still observing the formalities of military cooperation. The Battle of Calth drove the Ultramarines underground into a months-long war in cavern systems lit by the dying light of a star the Word-bearers had poisoned. A war so brutal that it left a mark on Ultramar's cultural memory that no subsequent century has fully erased. Through all of this, Horus moved toward Terra, slowly, deliberately, with the patience of a commander who knows that his ultimate destination was never in question. The path to Terra was always the point. Everything else was preparation. Of all the fates that befell the traitorous legions, perhaps none is more quietly terrible than what happened to Mortarian's Death Guard during the approach to Terra. The Death Guard were warriors of endurance. Where other legions prided themselves on speed or precision or spiritual ferocity, the Death Guard prided themselves on the capacity to outlast anything. They did not yield. They did not break. They advanced through environments that would have destroyed lesser forces, and they did so without complaint and without dramatics, because endurance was not a quality you performed. It was a quality you simply possessed or did not. Mortarion had bred this into them. It was, in its way, a form of pride. The Terminus Est, flagship of First Captain Typhon, whose loyalty to Horus had been secured even before Mortarion's, carried a secret cargo. Warp-infused plague, incubated in the ship's holds, introduced into the Death Guard fleet's atmospheric systems, while the Legion was becalmed in the warp, caught in a warp storm that Typhon himself had quietly engineered. Space Marines did not sicken. The Death Guard held this truth above all others, that their bodies were proof against plague, against toxin, against the ordinary vulnerabilities of flesh. And then the plague began. It moved through the Legion ship by ship, warrior by warrior, attacking the very biology that had been engineered to be impervious to biological attack. The Death Guard endured because endurance was what they were, and that endurance was the trap. They did not die quickly. They suffered slowly, comprehensively, in the holds of ships that had become hospitals and then charnel houses, calling upon their genetic gifts to resist something that had been specifically designed to circumvent those gifts. Mortarion, watching his legion die by degrees, did the only thing available to a man with no other option. He called upon the powers of the warp. Nurgle answered. The Death Guard were transformed, not healed in any ordinary sense, but remade. Their bodies were redesigned as vessels for plague, their immunity systems twisted into something that could contain, rather than merely resist, their rot made permanent and purposeful. They would never be sick again because they would never be well again. In exchange, they would live forever. The Plague Marines who emerged from that transformation were among the most durable warriors in the galaxy. They were also something that could no longer, in any honest sense, be called human. The endurance they had prided themselves on had been answered, preserved, and perverted beyond recognition when Horus's fleet broke through the final defensive cordons and entered the Sol system. Terra had been preparing for as long as it could. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists and Praetorian of Terra, had spent the preceding years overseeing the fortification of the Imperial Palace with a comprehensiveness that bordered on obsession. Every approach was covered. Every wall was thickened. Every potential landing zone was surveyed and defended. Dawn was not a man who engaged in false hope. He understood what was coming, and he worked with the cold clarity of an engineer who knows that his only task is to make the inevitable as costly as possible for the enemy. Sanguinius was on Terra when the fleet arrived. The Primarch of the Blood Angels, perhaps the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons, the only one whose beauty was consistently described as unearthly, whose wings marked him as something both more and less than his brothers, had been recalled to Terra when the scale of the rebellion became clear. He had agreed to come. He had agreed because Sanguinius was, of all the Primarchs, the one most clearly shaped by an awareness of his own mortality. He had seen visions of his death. He did not know exactly what they showed, but he understood their general direction. He came to Terra anyway. The Siege of Terra lasted 200 days. In practice, this is a number that the mind registers without fully accommodating. 200 days of orbital bombardment that made the atmosphere above Terra glow with secondary fires. 200 days of assault on walls that Dawn had built to withstand exactly this, and that nonetheless gave ground by meters and then by hundreds of meters as the pressure of 7 full legions was brought to bear. 200 days in which the defending forces, the Blood Angels, the Imperial Fists, the White Scars, the Sisters of Silence, the Custodians, and every militia force that could be armed and placed upon a wall, held what they could and retreated from what they could not hold. The outer walls of the Imperial Palace fell, then the secondary walls. The fighting moved into districts that had been civilian spaces, into the great processional boulevards, into the manufactoria and the basilicas, into every space that offered defensible ground and was then abandoned when the cost of holding it became too high. The Eternity Gate, the great entrance to the inner palace, was held, always held, at whatever cost required. The warp above Terra screamed. The Chaos Gods poured their energy into the assault, demons materializing in the breach points, warp eddies destabilizing the void shields, the pressure of entities whose true size could not be comprehended pressing against the thin boundary between the immaterium and reality. The Emperor, in the bowels of the palace, was maintaining the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that made warp travel possible for the whole Imperium. And something else, something he had not disclosed even to his closest advisors. He would not leave the palace's lower levels. He would not take the field, and those who survived the siege would spend the rest of their lives uncertain whether that choice was wisdom or tragedy. Not every thread of the siege belonged to the defenders alone. Relief was coming, though it moved through a warp that the Chaos Gods were actively distorting, and through a system defended by an orbital fleet that stretched across the Sol approaches. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars brought his legion through the blockade in a series of engagements that redefined the concept of rapid assault at void scale. The White Scars were not siege warriors. They were the riders of the steppe translated into the language of void combat, all momentum and misdirection, arriving where they were least expected and departing before a response could be coordinated. Khan broke through. His legion entered the battle for Terra and immediately became the most destabilizing force the traitors faced on the surface. Not because of their numbers, but because of their refusal to fight the battle on anyone's terms, but their own. And then, in the final days of the siege, the lion roared at last. Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, a man of secrets and silences whose loyalty had never been in doubt, but whose absence during the heresy had been conspicuous, arrived in the Sol system with his legion and dismantled the orbital blockade with a fury that suggested he was making up for lost time. The skies above Terra began, slowly, to clear. Reinforcement was coming. The clock, which had been running against the defenders since the first assault, began to shift. Horus knew this. He had always known that time was his enemy, that every day the siege continued was a day that allowed the loyalist legions scattered across the galaxy to recover, reform, and begin moving toward Terra. He had to break the palace before help arrived. He had not broken it. And so Horus made a decision that would determine everything. He dropped his void shields. The dropping of the Vengeful Spirit's void shields was not an act of defeat. It was an invitation. Horus had been told, by the powers in the warp whose instrument he had become, or by something within himself that still understood his father, that the Emperor would come, that the Emperor could not watch Terra fall without intervening personally, that the only path to ending the heresy quickly enough to matter was a direct confrontation, and that Horus, dropping his shields, was offering the Emperor the option of a direct confrontation on the War Master's own vessel. It was, depending on how you read it, either confidence or despair. The Emperor teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit with a small company: Sanguinius, the Custodians, Rogel Dawn. They materialized in a vessel that had been a masterpiece of Imperial engineering and was now something else. The walls breathing with warp energy, the corridors wrong in ways that geometry alone did not explain, the air carrying a taste that translated, in the human nervous system, as something between copper and grief. The Vengeful Spirit was no longer simply a ship. It was a place where the warp pressed close, where the chaos gods paid attention, where the rules that governed reality felt negotiable. They were separated almost immediately. The boarding party scattered by warp influence and ambush, each element drawn into its own terrible encounter. And Sanguinius, the Golden Primarch, the winged son who had foreseen his death and come to Terra regardless, reached the throne room of the War Master first. What passed between Sanguinius and Horus in that room, the records do not fully capture. Whether Horus asked him to stand aside, or offered him a choice, or whether any part of Horus that still remembered love was present in the exchange. None who witnessed it survived to give a full account. What is known is that Sanguinius refused. What is known is that Horus killed him. The death of Sanguinius was the most significant act of the heresy, in the way that the felling of a great tree is significant, not because of the sound it makes, but because of the space it leaves. Sanguinius was the one being in the galaxy who could reliably reach whatever remained of Horus's original self. His death closed that door. When the Emperor entered the throne room and looked upon his fallen son, whatever grief moved through him is unrecorded. It belonged to a man who did not show grief. The Emperor and Horus fought. The descriptions of that combat exist in fragments. Accounts from those who were present at the edges of the confrontation, corrupted by memory and warp exposure, and the sheer difficulty of processing what they had witnessed. What is consistent across all accounts is the scale of it, that the Vengeful Spirit shook, that the warp itself seemed to fold around the combatants, that the throne room was destroyed and rebuilt several times over as the duel passed through states of reality that ordinary physics does not recognize. The Emperor was losing. Horus, empowered by the full blessing of 4 chaos gods, was a being that had transcended what a Primarch could be, something that wore Horus's face and carried Horus's martial genius, but possessed a physical and psychic power that the Emperor, who had spent the final months of the siege maintaining the Astronomicon rather than preparing for combat, could not match. The Emperor was broken, dismembered, brought to the edge of death. One of the Emperor's custodians, Olanius Pius. Accounts differ on whether he was a custodian or simply a mortal soldier, but the accounts agree on what he did. Stepped between Horus and the Emperor, a single human body placed in the path of a Primarch, who had become something beyond a Primarch. He died in an instant, but in dying, he gave the Emperor a moment. In that moment, the Emperor looked at Horus and saw that Horus was still there. Beneath the warp's influence, beneath the corruption and the power and the terrible certainty, there was still the man the Emperor had made, still his son, still the War Master, still the boy found on Chthoniya, who had been given everything and given it back tenfold. And what remained of Horus in those final seconds was apparently sufficient to feel, if not regret exactly, then horror at what had been done in his name. A single instant of clarity in a decade of madness. The Emperor unleashed everything he had been holding back, not because he wanted to, but because Horus, in that final moment of returned awareness, apparently wanted him to. The release of that psychic force destroyed Horus completely. Not simply his body, but his soul, his presence in the warp, his echo in the immaterium. There would be no resurrection, no martyrdom to rally followers. Nothing remained of Horus but the brief awareness of what he had been and what he had destroyed, and then nothing at all. The Emperor was taken from the Vengeful Spirit in pieces. Rogel Dawn carried him. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists, a man not given to public displays of anything, was seen carrying his father through the corridors of the recovered battleship. And what was on his face in those corridors was not something that any witness chose to describe in great detail. Some things resist language. The Emperor was dying. He would not die. These two facts coexist in the subsequent history of the Imperium with a tension that no amount of theological framework has managed to resolve. The Golden Throne was a device of the Emperor's own construction. Part of the secret project he had been pursuing beneath the Imperial Palace during the final years of the Crusade. Its original purpose was connected to something called the Imperial Webway Project, an attempt to give humanity access to the alien network of tunnels that ran beneath real space, tunnels that the Eldar used to travel the galaxy without entering the warp. The project was destroyed when Magnus's psychic warning breached the warding around the throne chamber, and the Golden Throne had since been repurposed as a life support mechanism of last resort. The Emperor was placed upon it. He has not left it since. His body is sustained by mechanisms that require constant maintenance and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, men and women brought to Terra from across the Imperium, offered to the throne, their souls consumed to maintain the psychic beacon that illuminates the warp for human navigation. Without the Astronomicon, warp travel becomes functionally impossible. Without warp travel, the Imperium ceases to be an entity and becomes 10,000 isolated worlds, each one alone in the dark. And so, the sacrifice continues, every day, for 10,000 years. Whether the Emperor is conscious upon the throne, whether he thinks, plans, guides, or experiences anything at all, is not known. The Adeptus Custodes who guard him report nothing. The High Lords of Terra who govern in his name claim divine guidance, though the nature of that guidance is opaque to any independent examination. The psychers of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica sense something on the throne. Whether it is awareness or simply the enormous psychic output of a being too powerful to fully die, they cannot say. The Primarchs who survived, Guilliman, the Lion, the Khan, Dawn, Vulcan, Corax, eventually scattered or vanished or retreated into stasis, into crusade, into wounds physical and spiritual from which recovery was not possible on any ordinary timescale. They had been made for a father who no longer walked among them. Without him, the purpose that had ordered their existence was gone, and in its absence each of them found only the evidence of everything that had been lost. 10,000 years have passed since the Siege of Terra. The Imperium endures. It endures in the way that old wounds endure, not healed, not fully open, but incorporated into the structure of the body that carries them. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy was not the rational secular civilization the Emperor designed. It became exactly what the Emperor had declared humanity must never become: a theocracy, a religion of the God Emperor, a state organized around the divine authority of a being who never asked for divinity and almost certainly would not have approved of what was built in his name. The traitor legions retreated into the Eye of Terror, the great warp rift that had torn open near the galactic center during the fall of the Eldar, now become a permanent feature of galactic geography. Its depths home to armies that did not age and did not forget, they have launched incursions across 10 millennia. Some of them have been checked. Some have done damage that took generations to repair. The Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler, who bears the gene seed of Horus himself, have punctuated the history of the Imperium like chapters in a document no one finished writing. The Blood Angels carry Sanguinius in their blood, his gene seed replicated in every warrior of the chapter, his final hours echoing in the black rage that claims some of them, his face occasionally appearing on warriors who fall into the Death Company's fugue state, who fight in those final hours again and again until death releases them. The chapter grieves him still. They do not use the word grief. They have other words, but the meaning is the same. The Iron Hands removed their flesh and replaced it with metal where they could, because flesh had proven treacherous in the moment of Ferrus Manus' death, and metal, at least, did not waver. The Raven Guard faded further into shadow. The Salamanders kept the faith of Vulcan, that humanity is worth protecting, not simply worth governing, and carried it into a future that gave them little reason to maintain it, and every reason to be grateful they did. And somewhere beneath the Imperial Palace, in a chamber that is simultaneously the most important room in the galaxy, and the least visited by those with the luxury of choice, the Emperor sits, sustained by sacrifice, powering the beacon that keeps 10,000 worlds connected, neither alive in any sense that the men who built the life support systems fully understand, nor dead in any sense that the powers in the warp have been able to complete. He was a man who made demigods and called them sons, who built a civilization in his own image and watched it consumed by the flame that his own ambition kindled, who fought a god-empowered version of his firstborn child to a mutual destruction that saved the species and broke everything else. Whether he anticipated this outcome, whether the long game he played across millennia included this, no one knows. The evidence for his omniscience and the evidence for his tragic miscalculation are both compelling and both incomplete. He left no account. He left no final word. He left only the throne and the silence, and a galaxy that has been mourning him ever since without fully knowing how to stop. And so, wherever you are tonight, in whatever darkness surrounds you, let the heresy settle into the distance where history lives. Its wars are 10,000 years gone. Its grief belongs to a galaxy still learning to carry it. You are here now, in the quiet of your own moment, far from the fires of Isstvan and the black walls of the Vengeful Spirit. Let the weight of it go. Let the names and the battles and the terrible beauty of it all drift back into the dark from which they came. You listened. You carried it for a little while. That is enough. Rest now. The Emperor watches still, and whatever that watching means, in the long mystery of what he has become, there is something in it that resembles vigil, something that has not ceased, something that holds the line between the dark and everything worth protecting, as it always has. Sleep well. The night is long, but mornings come.